The day my wife left me, the sky over Chicago looked like it couldn't decide whether to rain or clear. Gray clouds drifted between the skyscrapers, and the cold November wind rattled the windows of our tiny apartment. Looking back, I should have noticed the signs weeks earlier, the late-night text messages, the expensive perfume she suddenly started wearing, the way she smiled at her phone but barely looked at me anymore. My name is Ethan Carter, and 5 years ago I was 33 years old, working 12-hour days as a mechanical engineer for a manufacturing company. I wasn't rich. I wasn't famous. But I believed I was building something that mattered. Every spare dollar I earned went into a small technology startup I was building from the corner of our apartment. It wasn't glamorous. There was no fancy office, no investors, no luxury cars, just a folding table, 2 old laptops, and hundreds of sleepless nights. Emily used to believe in that dream. When we first met 8 years earlier at a neighborhood coffee shop, she loved how ambitious I was. "I don't need a millionaire," she'd told me on our 3rd date. "I just want someone who refuses to quit." I believed her. I married her because I thought she loved the man, not the money. For years we were happy, or at least I thought we were. Our apartment was small, enough that you could hear the upstairs neighbors arguing every weekend. The kitchen barely fit 2 people. The heater groaned all winter. Our old pickup truck had over 200,000 miles on it. But every Friday night, we'd order cheap pizza, watch old movies, and laugh until midnight. Those memories felt real. Now I'm not so sure. 3 weeks before she left, everything started changing. Emily suddenly became interested in things she'd never cared about before. Luxury watches, designer handbags, private clubs. She began following wealthy influencers online and talking about people I'd never heard of. One evening, she walked into our apartment carrying 3 shopping bags from stores we could never afford. I looked at the receipts. Nearly $4,000. My stomach tightened. "Emily, where did this money come from?" She smiled without looking at me. "A friend helped." "What friend?" "You don't know him." That answer sat in my chest like a stone. A few days later, I came home early from work. Emily was standing on the balcony laughing on the phone. The moment she saw me, she ended the call. "Who was that?" "No one." "No one keeps you laughing for 30 minutes. She rolled her eyes. "Why are you acting so insecure?" "I'm asking a simple question. And I'm tired of explaining every little thing." That was the first real argument we'd had in years. She accused me of working too much. I reminded her I was working for our future. She laughed. "Our future? You've been saying that for 3 years. My company is getting close. Close doesn't pay bills, Ethan." "It will." "When?" I didn't have an answer. The following weekend, she insisted we attend a charity gala. I told her we couldn't afford tickets. She smiled. "We don't have to. They're free." "Free?" Nothing in Chicago was free, but somehow we ended up inside one of the most luxurious hotels I'd ever seen. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings 3 stories high. Women wore dresses worth more than my yearly salary. Men talked about private jets like they were discussing the weather. I felt completely out of place. Emily looked perfectly comfortable. Too comfortable. People greeted her by name. Waiters already knew what she wanted to drink. Something wasn't right. About an hour into the evening, a man approached us. He looked to be in his early 50s. Perfectly tailored suit. Silver hair. A watch worth more than my truck. Confident smile. "Emily." He kissed her hand. She smiled back in a way I'd never seen before. "Ethan," she said quietly. "This is Richard Langford." He extended his hand. "Pleasure." His grip was firm. His confidence effortless. "I've heard a lot about you." I forced a smile. "Really?" "Oh, yes." He looked around the ballroom. "Emily speaks very highly of your determination." There was something strange about the pause before the last word. Almost like he'd chosen it carefully. Throughout the evening, Richard barely left Emily's side. He told stories about buying hotels in Miami, vacation homes in Aspen, business deals in New York, private islands. Emily laughed at every joke, every single one. Meanwhile, I stood there feeling invisible. On the drive home, the silence lasted nearly 20 minutes. Finally, I asked, How long have you known him? She stared out the passenger window. A few months. A few months? I met him through charity work. You've never mentioned him. I didn't think it mattered. It matters now. She sighed dramatically. You're making something out of nothing. Maybe I was. Maybe I wasn't. The next week became unbearable. Emily stopped eating dinner with me. She started coming home after midnight. Some nights she didn't come home at all. When I asked where she'd been, with friends. What friends? You don't know them. Always the same answer. One Friday morning, I found hotel receipts in her purse. 2 nights. Luxury suite. Downtown Chicago. 2 guests. I sat there staring at the paper until my hands started shaking. Then I folded it back exactly as I'd found it. I wanted to confront her. But a small part of me was terrified of hearing the truth. That same afternoon, something incredible happened. An investor finally responded to my startup. Not just any investor. One of the biggest venture capital firms in Illinois wanted to see my prototype. The meeting was scheduled for Monday morning. If it went well, everything would change. Years of sacrifice might finally pay off. I couldn't wait to tell Emily. I rushed home carrying flowers, her favorite chocolate, and a bottle of sparkling cider. The apartment was dark. She wasn't home. Instead, I found a single envelope lying on the kitchen table. My name was written across the front. Inside were divorce papers. My vision blurred. Then I noticed another piece of paper folded underneath. A handwritten letter. My hands trembled as I opened it. Ethan, you're a good man, but being good isn't enough anymore. I'm tired of waiting for dreams that never happen. I want security. I want a life where I don't have to count every dollar. Richard can give me that. Maybe one day you'll understand that love doesn't pay the mortgage. Please don't try to find me, Emily. I read it 3 times. Then 4. Every word felt colder than the last. The flowers slipped from my hand and hit the floor. An hour later, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. It was only a photo. Emily, standing beside Richard. A brand new silver Rolls-Royce. She was smiling. On her left hand, a diamond ring that hadn't been there a week ago. Beneath the picture was a single sentence. You deserve someone who believes in your dreams. I deserve someone who can make mine come true. I stared at the screen until tears blurred the words. At that moment, I thought I had lost everything. I had no idea. Life was about to take something even more precious from me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat alone on the apartment floor, surrounded by unopened moving boxes we had bought for a future that would never happen. The flowers I'd brought home for Emily lay scattered across the kitchen tiles, their petals already beginning to wilt. It was strange how quickly something beautiful could fall apart. Just 24 hours earlier, I had been planning a celebration. Now I was signing divorce papers with shaking hands. Not because I wanted to, because I couldn't force someone to love me. Around 3 in the morning, I finally stood up and walked into our bedroom. Half of the closet was empty. Her favorite dresses were gone. Her shoes. Her jewelry. Even the framed wedding photo from her nightstand had disappeared. She hadn't just left. She had planned her escape for weeks, maybe months. The next morning, my phone rang. It was my younger sister, Rachel. Ethan, you sound terrible. I tried to lie. I'm fine. No, you're not. I stayed silent. Then everything came pouring out. Emily, Richard, the divorce papers, the photograph. When I finished, Rachel didn't speak for several seconds. Finally, she whispered, I'm coming over. You don't have to. I'm already in my car. Rachel arrived carrying coffee and breakfast sandwiches. The moment she walked through the door, she hugged me so tightly that I nearly broke down. She looked around the apartment. So, she really took everything. I nodded. Rachel clenched her jaw. I never trusted her. I looked up. What? She hesitated. I didn't tell you because I thought I was imagining things. What things? I saw her having lunch with an older man about 2 months ago. My stomach tightened. Richard. I didn't know his name. Why didn't you tell me? I asked her who he was. And? She said he was helping organize a charity fundraiser. The same lie. She'd been telling everyone the same story. Monday morning arrived. The biggest meeting of my career. Normally, I would have canceled. Instead, I forced myself to go. Because heartbreak doesn't stop rent from being due. The venture capital office overlooked downtown Chicago. Glass walls, modern furniture. Everything screamed success. 3 investors listened as I demonstrated my software. I explained how it could predict equipment. Failures before factories lost. Millions in downtime. They asked difficult questions. I answered everyone. After nearly 2 hours, the lead investor smiled. We're impressed. For the first time in days, I felt hope. We'd like to begin due diligence. I could barely breathe. It wasn't a final deal, but it was the first real opportunity I'd ever had. Walking back to my truck, I almost reached for my phone to call Emily. Then I remembered. There was no Emily anymore. That evening, I stopped by our mailbox one last time. Among the bills was a small white envelope. It was addressed to both of us. Inside was something I'd completely forgotten. The results from a medical clinic. 3 weeks earlier, Emily had insisted we both complete routine health screenings. I opened the paperwork without thinking. Then my eyes landed on a single sentence. Pregnancy test, positive. My heart stopped. I checked the name. Emily Carter. Positive. 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 I read it over and over. She'd been pregnant. Our baby. I dropped into the driver's seat of my truck, unable to breathe. Did she know? Had the clinic called her first? Was that why she'd been acting so strangely? I grabbed my phone and dialed her number. Straight to voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Again. Blocked. I tried her email. No response. I even drove to the luxury condominium where Richard supposedly lived. Security refused to let me inside. I left a message anyway. She never answered. For weeks, I carried that medical report folded inside my wallet. Every morning I looked at it. Every night I wondered, was I already a father? Or had she decided not to keep the baby? The silence was unbearable. No answers. No closure. Only questions. Winter settled over Chicago. Snow covered the streets. Christmas lights appeared in every neighborhood. Families gathered. Children laughed. Meanwhile, I buried myself in work. If I stopped moving, I started thinking. If I started thinking, I remembered her. So I worked. 18 hours a day, sometimes 20. The startup became my entire life. One evening, Rachel showed up unexpectedly. She carried groceries and forced me to eat something besides instant noodles. Halfway through dinner, she looked at me carefully. You still carry that report, don't you? I nodded. You should let it go. I can't. Ethan, what if there's a child out there? What if she never tells me? Rachel reached across the table. If there is, you'll find out someday. I wanted to believe her. I really did. 3 months later, everything changed. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I received a call from an unfamiliar hospital number. This is Mercy General Hospital. My heart immediately raced. We're trying to reach Emily Carter's emergency contact. I stood up so quickly my chair fell backward. What happened? There was a long pause. I'm very sorry. The nurse explained that Emily had been admitted several weeks earlier, following severe complications. My hands began shaking. The pregnancy... Another pause. I'm sorry. There was no way to save the baby. I couldn't speak. For several seconds, I forgot how to breathe. The child I'd never even known was gone. The nurse continued. Mrs. Carter is no longer listed under that name. She had already changed it. Emily Langford. The divorce had become official. The marriage to Richard had happened almost immediately. And just like that, the last connection between us disappeared forever. That night I drove to the edge of Lake Michigan. The wind howled across the frozen water. I stood alone beneath the city lights. For the first time in my life, I screamed. Not because Emily had left. Not because another man had taken my place. But because somewhere in the world, there should have been a little boy or girl calling me Dad. Instead, there was only silence. I made one promise to myself that night. I would never allow heartbreak to define the rest of my life. I would build something so meaningful that the pain would have a purpose. Not to make Emily jealous. Not to prove Richard wrong. but to honor the child who never had the chance to grow up. From that moment on, every late night, every sacrifice, every impossible decision would carry one silent dedication for the son or daughter I would never get to meet. What I didn't know was that fate wasn't finished with Emily, because while I was rebuilding my life from the ashes, the glamorous life she had chosen was already beginning to crack. And one day, those cracks would become impossible to hide. The morning after I buried the last hope of ever meeting my child, I walked into my tiny apartment, packed every photograph that reminded me of Emily into a single cardboard box, sealed it with duct tape, and carried it into a storage unit across town. I made myself one promise. I would never open that box again until I no longer felt anything. Not anger, not love, not regret, just peace. It sounded impossible. At the time, it probably was. Over the next 2 years, my world became painfully simple. Wake up, work, sleep for a few hours. Repeat. While most people spent weekends at football games or family barbecues, I lived inside a rented warehouse that doubled as my company's first office. The paint was peeling. The heating barely worked. When it rained, buckets caught the leaks from the ceiling. But to me, it was paradise. Because every hour I spent there was one less hour thinking about the life I'd lost. The investment firm that had shown interest in my software eventually agreed to fund the company, not with millions, just enough to hire 3 employees and keep the lights on. The first person I hired was Marcus Hill, a software engineer who had been laid off from a larger tech company. During his interview, he asked a question no one else had. Why are you really building this company? Most founders talked about profits, market share, innovation. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. Because I know what it feels like to lose everything. Marcus smiled. I can work with that. He became more than an employee. He became my closest friend. A few months later, our small team grew to 6 people, then 10, then 20. We celebrated every new customer with cheap pizza and grocery store cupcakes. No one cared that our office furniture came from thrift stores. We were building something together, something real. For the first time since my marriage ended, I felt like I belonged somewhere. One Friday evening, Marcus tossed a business magazine onto my desk. Take a look. The cover featured a smiling Richard Langford standing in front of one of his luxury developments. The headline read, "The King of Chicago Real Estate." I stared at the picture. Standing beside Richard was Emily. Perfect hair, designer dress, diamond necklace. She looked happy, at least in the photograph. Marcus noticed my expression. You know them? I closed the magazine. I used to. He didn't ask another question. Good friends know when silence is the kindest thing they can offer. Our first major breakthrough came almost by accident. A massive automotive manufacturer tested our predictive maintenance software. Within 3 months, they reported that unexpected equipment failures had dropped by nearly 40%. The savings were enormous. Word spread faster than we could handle. Suddenly, companies from across the country wanted demonstrations. Our phones never stopped ringing. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't destined to fail. Then, exactly 3 years after Emily walked away, I received an invitation to speak at a national technology conference in San Francisco. Standing backstage, I remembered all the times people had laughed at my dream. All the nights Emily had asked when my little company would finally make money. Now, hundreds of business leaders were waiting to hear my presentation. As I walked onto the stage, the audience applauded. Not because they knew my story, because they knew my company. And somehow, that hurt less than I expected. The company continued to grow. By the 4th year, we had offices in 3 states. More than 300 employees. Contracts with some of the largest manufacturers in America. Reporters started calling. Business podcasts wanted interviews. Magazines labeled me one of the fastest rising entrepreneurs in the country. I accepted only a handful of interviews. Fame had never been my goal. Purpose was. Despite the success, I never forgot where I came from. Every Christmas, our company paid off medical bills for families who couldn't afford them. We funded scholarships for engineering students. We donated equipment to public schools. Marcus once asked why we gave away so much money. I smiled, because someone who has known real loss understands what hope is worth. One snowy December afternoon, Rachel visited our headquarters. She walked through the building in complete disbelief. "You built all of this?" I laughed. "We all did." She hugged me tightly. "I'm proud of you." Those 4 words meant more than every business award sitting in my office. As the 5th anniversary of my divorce approached, life had become almost unrecognizable. The struggling engineer with an old pickup truck was gone. In his place stood the CEO of a company valued at nearly $900 million. I finally bought a home. Not a mansion, just a quiet house overlooking Lake Michigan, big enough to host family dinners, big enough to remind me that success didn't have to be loud. One evening, Marcus handed me a folder. "You should see this." Inside was an invitation to the annual Chicago Business Excellence Gala. Every major entrepreneur in the city would be attending, including Langford Developments, Richard Langford, and Emily. Marcus looked uncomfortable. "We don't have to go." I closed the folder. For several seconds, I said nothing. 5 years earlier, the thought of seeing Emily again would have terrified me. Now, I wasn't afraid. Not because I'd stopped remembering, but because I'd finally stopped living in the past. I smiled. "We'll be there." What I didn't know was that by the time the gala arrived, Richard Langford's empire would be collapsing behind closed doors. And the woman who once left me for wealth was about to discover that not every fortune lasts forever. The Chicago Business Excellence Gala was held in the same luxury hotel where I'd first met Richard Langford. 5 years earlier, I'd walked through those doors wearing an inexpensive suit, wondering whether I belonged. Tonight, the valet greeted me by name. The event organizers personally welcomed me. Reporters waited near the entrance, hoping for interviews. Life had a strange sense of humor. Marcus adjusted his tie and grinned. Feeling nervous? I looked around the glittering ballroom. Crystal chandeliers, a live orchestra, champagne flowing like water. The exact same room where my marriage had quietly begun to fall apart. I admitted, but not anymore. The ballroom buzzed with conversation as executives, politicians, and investors mingled. Several people stopped to congratulate me on our company's rapid growth. One elderly businessman shook my hand. "Mr. Carter, your company saved our manufacturing division. We owe you a great deal." I smiled. "You owe my engineers. They did the hard work." Marcus leaned over and whispered, "You know, that's why people want to work for you." Before I could answer, a familiar voice echoed across the room. "Richard Langford has arrived." Instinctively, I turned. Richard entered with the same confident stride I remembered. His tuxedo was flawless, his smile practiced. But something was different. The confidence seemed forced. His hair was thinner. Dark circles framed his eyes. Even from across the ballroom, he looked exhausted. Walking beside him was Emily. For a moment, I barely recognized her. She was still beautiful, but the brightness I'd once loved had faded. She smiled for the cameras, yet the smile never reached her eyes. Her shoulders were tense. She looked tired. Not physically, emotionally, as though carrying a weight no one else could see. She hadn't noticed me yet. Richard had. Our eyes met across the room. For a brief second, surprise flashed across his face. Then he recovered and offered a polite nod. I returned it. Nothing more. No anger. No challenge. No bitterness. That seemed to confuse him more than hostility would have. About 20 minutes later, I found myself speaking with a group of investors when someone quietly said my name. "Ethan." I turned. Emily stood only a few feet away. The room suddenly felt silent. 5 years. 5 years without hearing her voice. She looked at me carefully, almost as if comparing the man before her to the memory she'd carried. "You look different," she whispered. I smiled politely. "It's been a while." She nodded. "It has." Neither of us moved. Neither of us knew what came next. Finally, she spoke again. "I heard about your company." "Thank you. I'm happy for you." There was a sadness in her voice that hadn't existed years ago. Before either of us could continue, Richard appeared beside her. "Ethan." "Richard." The handshake between us lasted only a second. His grip wasn't nearly as strong as I remembered. Richard forced a smile. I have to admit, you've done remarkably well. I've been fortunate. No, he replied quietly. Fortune has nothing to do with it. For the first time, I heard something unexpected in his voice. Respect. Maybe even regret. Emily glanced between us. I should. She stopped herself. I hope life has been good to you. It has. I meant it. Not because it had been easy. Because I'd finally found peace. She lowered her eyes before walking away beside Richard. Marcus appeared moments later. That looked uncomfortable. It wasn't. You okay? I watched Emily disappear into the crowd. For the first time in years, I really am. Later that evening, the event host invited me onto the stage to accept the Innovation Leadership Award. As I stood at the podium, hundreds of faces looked back at me. Among them, Emily. Richard. I hadn't prepared a speech. Instead, I spoke from the heart. 5 years ago, I began. I believed success meant proving people wrong. The room grew quiet. I was wrong. I paused. Success isn't about making your critics regret doubting you. It's about becoming someone your younger self would be proud of. Several people nodded. I've learned that money comes and goes. Businesses rise and fall. But your character, that's the one investment that never loses value. The audience erupted into applause. As I stepped away from the microphone, I noticed Emily wiping away a tear. The gala ended shortly after 10 o'clock. Marcus and I walked toward the parking area. As we reached my car, I noticed Richard standing alone beside his black sedan. No photographers, no admirers, just him. He looked older than 50 now. He hesitated before approaching. Ethan, do you have a minute? Marcus glanced at me. I'll wait in the car. After he left, Richard sighed heavily. I owe you an apology. I raised an eyebrow. For what? For more things than I can count. The words caught me off guard. I knew Emily was married when we met. I convinced myself your marriage was already over. I told myself I wasn't stealing someone else's life. He looked down. I was lying to myself. Neither of us spoke. Finally, he continued. You deserved better. I stared at him for several seconds, then quietly answered, That was 5 years ago. I know. I've already forgiven both of you. Richard looked genuinely shocked. You have? Holding on to hate only keeps the wound open. He laughed bitterly. I wish I'd learned that sooner. Before leaving, Richard reached into his pocket and handed me a business card. If you ever hear anything about my company over the next few weeks. He stopped. Don't believe everything you read. What do you mean? He forced a tired smile. Let's just say, not every empire is as strong as it looks. Then he walked away. 3 days later, the headlines exploded across every business news website. Langford developments under federal investigation. Major investors withdraw billions. Multiple projects frozen. I stared at the news on my office computer. Marcus rushed into my office holding his tablet. You've seen it. I nodded. Looks serious. It's worse than serious. He placed the tablet on my desk. Several banks have already begun foreclosure proceedings. Within hours, Richard Langford's business empire began collapsing in public. Stock prices crashed. Investors fled. Luxury properties were seized. Television crews camped outside company headquarters. The billionaire who once seemed untouchable was losing everything. And somewhere inside that collapsing world was Emily, the woman who had once believed wealth could guarantee happiness. She was about to learn that sometimes the most expensive life comes with the highest price. Within a week, Richard Langford's empire was in freefall. Every major business network carried the story. Financial analysts debated whether his company could survive. Employees feared layoffs. Construction projects stopped overnight. Banks froze accounts. Investors filed lawsuits. The man who had once seemed untouchable was suddenly fighting to keep everything from collapsing. My public relations team expected me to comment. After all, everyone in Chicago knew about my history with Richard. Some reporters even hinted that I must be enjoying his downfall. They couldn't have been more wrong. When a journalist asked whether I considered it karma, I answered with one sentence, I don't celebrate another person's suffering. The interview ended there. Marcus smiled after watching it. You just ruined every headline they wanted. Good. Over the next month, our company continued growing. We signed the largest contract in our history with a national manufacturing group. The deal pushed our company's valuation past $1 billion. Employees cheered. Champagne bottles popped. Someone even hung a banner across the office that read, "We did it." I thanked every employee personally. This company was never built by one person. It was built by people who refused to quit. That evening, I skipped the celebration and drove home to my lake house. Success felt meaningful only when it was shared. So I invited Rachel and her family for dinner instead. Watching my young nephew race around the backyard with his toy airplane filled a place in my heart I thought would always remain empty. Children have a way of reminding adults that hope never truly disappears. A few days later, I stopped by a neighborhood grocery store. For the first time in months, I was shopping without bodyguards, assistants, or business meetings waiting, just another customer pushing a shopping cart. As I reached for a loaf of bread, I heard a familiar voice behind me. Ethan? I turned slowly. Emily. She wore a simple blue sweater and jeans. No designer handbag. No expensive jewelry. No flawless makeup. She looked ordinary. More importantly, she looked nervous. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she smiled weakly. I didn't expect to see you here. I live nearby. I know. The words slipped out before she could stop them. You know. She looked embarrassed. I read an interview. I nodded politely. How have you been? She looked down at the shopping basket in her hands. I've had better years. There was an awkward silence. Then she quietly asked, Would you mind having coffee sometime? The request caught me off guard. Coffee? She struggled to find the words. I think we have things we never talked about. 5 years of unanswered questions flashed through my mind. Part of me wanted to say no. Another part wanted to finally close a chapter that had remained unfinished. I answered carefully, 1 cup of coffee. She nodded. That's all I'm asking. We met 2 days later at the same little coffee shop where we'd had our first date, 8 years earlier. Time had changed the place very little. The old wooden tables were still there. The smell of fresh coffee still filled the air. Only we had changed. Emily wrapped both hands around her cup, though she never took a sip. I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything. Yes. Her voice trembled. I do. She took a deep breath. I was selfish. I thought money would solve every problem. I thought success belonged to whoever had the biggest house, the nicest car, the most expensive vacations. She laughed bitterly. I confuse comfort with happiness. I listened without interrupting. She deserved the chance to speak. Tears gathered in her eyes. Richard wasn't the man I thought he was. I remained silent. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't abusive. But he loved winning more than people. Every conversation became another business meeting. Every vacation became another networking event. I spent years living in beautiful houses that never felt like home. She looked directly at me. And every time something went wrong, I remembered our tiny apartment. Our cheap Friday night pizzas. The way you looked at me like I was the only person in the world. A tear rolled down her cheek. I traded all of that for things. I slowly stirred my coffee. Why are you telling me this now? She hesitated. Because I should have told you years ago. There wasn't a day that passed when I didn't think about the life we almost had. Then she whispered something that froze me. I knew about the baby. My hand stopped moving. You knew? She nodded. The clinic called me the day before I left. Every sound inside the coffee shop seemed to disappear. You knew. And you still left? Fresh tears streamed down her face. I thought Richard could give our child a better future. She covered her face with trembling hands. I was wrong. So terribly wrong. I closed my eyes. 5 years. 5 years believing she never knew. The truth hurt even more. I lost the baby 6 weeks later. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I wanted to call you. I tried 100 times. But every time, I convinced myself you hated me. I finally looked at her. I didn't hate you. I hated what happened. She cried harder. I've hated myself every single day. When the conversation ended, we walked outside together. Snowflakes drifted through the cold afternoon air. Emily stood beside the sidewalk, clutching her coat tightly. I don't expect forgiveness. I answered honestly, I forgave you years ago. She looked surprised. But forgiveness doesn't erase the past. She nodded slowly. I know. As she turned to leave, she stopped. Ethan? I looked back. For what it's worth, you became exactly the man I always believed you could be. She smiled sadly before walking away. I watched until she disappeared around the corner. I thought that would be the last time I'd ever see her. I was wrong, because 3 weeks later, at exactly 8:17 on a rainy Tuesday morning, the receptionist called my office. Mr. Carter, there's a woman downstairs asking to see you. She refuses to leave. What's her name? The receptionist hesitated. It's Emily. And she says, it's a matter of life and death. I stared at the phone for several seconds after my receptionist finished speaking. A matter of life and death? Yes, sir. She wouldn't explain anything else. I looked through the glass wall of my office. Beyond it, hundreds of employees moved through another ordinary Tuesday morning. Meetings, deadlines, coffee cups. No one knew that my past had just walked through the front door. I took a slow breath. Send her up. A minute later, the elevator doors opened. Emily stepped out. She looked even more exhausted than she had at the coffee shop. Her eyes were red from crying. She clutched a worn folder against her chest as though it were the only thing keeping her standing. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I gestured toward the chair across from my desk. Please. She sat carefully. Her hands shook so badly that the folder slipped onto the floor. I bent down to pick it up. Medical records, legal documents, collection notices, past due bills. My heart sank. I'm sorry, she whispered. I never wanted you to see those. I handed the folder back. You said it was a matter of life and death. She nodded. It is. She swallowed hard before continuing. Richard is dying. The words hung in the air. Dying? Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. I leaned back in my chair. When did he find out? 6 months ago. He kept it secret from almost everyone. Suddenly, his tired face at the gala made sense. The apology, the exhaustion, the sadness in his eyes. He had already known. Emily wiped away another tear. The investigation destroyed his company. The cancer destroyed everything else. He sold nearly all of his assets to pay employees and settle lawsuits. I frowned. He paid the employees first? She nodded. He said he'd spent his whole life chasing money. In the end, he wanted to leave behind something better than headlines. For the first time, I saw Richard differently. Not as the man who had taken my wife, but as a flawed human being trying to make peace with his mistakes. Why are you here, Emily? She looked at me with eyes filled with shame. He wants to see you. I blinked. Me? He said there's something he has to tell you before it's too late. Silence settled between us. Every instinct told me to refuse. The past had already taken enough from me. But another voice inside whispered something different. Some conversations don't happen because we want them to. They happen because we need them. When? She lowered her eyes. Today. That afternoon, I drove to a private hospice on the outskirts of Chicago. The building overlooked a quiet garden filled with blooming flowers. It didn't look like a place where people came to die. It looked peaceful. Emily led me down a long hallway. Outside one room, she stopped. He's been waiting. She quietly stepped aside. I opened the door. Richard looked nothing like the powerful businessman I remembered. The expensive suits were gone. His once broad shoulders had become painfully thin. Machines quietly monitored his heartbeat. For a moment, he simply smiled. You came. I pulled a chair beside the bed. You asked? He nodded. Thank you. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Richard broke the silence. I owe you the truth. I waited. The day Emily left, I believed I had won. He laughed weakly. I thought money made me the better man. He shook his head. I was wrong. He coughed before continuing. You spent 5 years building something people respected. I spent 5 years protecting something that was already falling apart. He reached into the bedside drawer and removed a sealed envelope. I've carried this for years. He handed it to me. Open it after I'm gone. What is it? My apology. And something that belongs to you. I stared at the envelope but didn't open it. Not yet. Richard looked toward the window. Do you know what Emily talked about most? I didn't answer. Friday night pizza. I almost smiled. Your old pickup truck. The apartment where the heater barely worked. He laughed softly. I owned penthouses around the world. And all she ever missed was home. A tear rolled down his cheek. I couldn't compete with memories. You don't realize it when you're young. But peace is worth more than luxury. He turned back toward me. I hope you never forget that. Just then, Emily quietly entered the room. She stood beside the bed and gently held Richard's hand. He smiled at her. I'm sorry. She shook her head. You already said that. I know. I just needed to say it again. She leaned down and kissed his forehead. No more apologies. Just rest. As I stood to leave, Richard stopped me. Ethan? I turned. If life gives someone a second chance, don't waste it the way I wasted mine. Those were the last words he ever spoke to me. Richard Langford passed away peacefully early the next morning. 3 days later, after the funeral, I finally opened the envelope he'd given me. Inside was a handwritten letter. It began with words I never expected to read. Ethan, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I spent years believing I stole your wife because I was richer. The truth is, I stole her because she was confused. And I was arrogant enough to believe money could replace love. It couldn't. I kept reading. Then I reached the final page. Folded inside was another document. A legal transfer. Richard had donated millions of dollars from his remaining estate to create a foundation in memory of the unborn child Emily and I had lost. The foundation's name was already printed across the top. The Carter Hope Foundation. Emily had never told him to do it. He had done it himself, as one final attempt to leave the world better than he had found it. I sat in my office holding the papers, unable to speak. 5 years earlier, I thought Richard Langford had taken everything from me. Now, his final act had returned something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope. But there was still one question neither Emily nor I had answered. After everything that had happened, could two broken people ever build something new? Or were some doors meant to stay closed forever? Richard's funeral was small. Nothing like the glamorous parties that had once surrounded his name. There were no television cameras. No crowds of investors. No politicians eager to shake his hand. Only a handful of former employees. A few old friends. Emily and me. The pastor said something that stayed with me. A person's final chapter should never be judged only by the mistakes in the first chapters. I looked toward Richard's casket. 5 years earlier, I had blamed him for destroying my life. Now I realized the truth was more complicated. He had made terrible choices. So had Emily. So had I. Life was rarely as simple as heroes and villains. A month later, the Carter Hope Foundation officially opened. Instead of focusing on business, we dedicated it to helping families who had experienced pregnancy loss, offering counseling, financial assistance, and support for parents who felt alone. At the opening ceremony, reporters asked why I had chosen such a personal cause. I answered honestly. Some people leave behind buildings. Some leave behind companies. I hope this foundation leaves behind hope. The story spread across the country. Thousands of families wrote letters, thanking us for recognizing a kind of grief that often goes unnoticed. Many of those letters reduced me to tears. For the first time, I felt as though the child we never met had changed lives anyway. Emily volunteered at the foundation almost every day. She never asked for a salary. She greeted grieving parents, organized support groups, and quietly listened to stories that mirrored her own. One afternoon, I found her sitting alone in the memorial garden. She was holding a tiny pair of knitted baby booties that someone had donated. They remind me of ours, she whispered. I sat beside her. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, she asked the question I knew had been waiting between us for months. Do you think people can ever truly change? I looked across the garden before answering. I think people change when pain teaches them what pride never could. She nodded slowly. I've changed. I know. You believe me? I do. She looked surprised. But believing you've changed, I continued gently, isn't the same as pretending the past never happened. Over the next several weeks, we spent more time together. Sometimes it was simply discussing foundation projects. Sometimes it was sharing lunch after meetings. Other times we walked along Lake Michigan without saying much at all. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. Rachel noticed. One evening over dinner, she finally asked the question everyone else was thinking. Are you falling in love with her again? I set down my fork. I don't know. Rachel smiled sadly. Be careful. I will. Your heart survived once. I don't want to watch it break again. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I don't either. That autumn, the foundation hosted a charity gala. Unlike the lavish events Richard had once loved, this one focused entirely on the families we served. Instead of luxury auctions, parents shared stories of healing. Instead of celebrities, nurses and counselors received awards. Near the end of the evening, a little girl walked onto the stage carrying a handmade card. She couldn't have been older than 8. She looked around nervously before finding me. This is for Mr. Carter. I opened the card. Inside, written in uneven handwriting, were the words, Thank you for helping my mommy smile again. Nothing in my business career, not the billion-dollar valuation, not the awards, not the magazine covers, had ever meant as much as that simple sentence. I folded the card carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. I still carry it today. Later that night, Emily found me standing on the terrace overlooking the city. It's beautiful, she said. It is. She hesitated before speaking again. I've spent years wishing I could undo one decision. You can't. I know. She looked down. But if you gave me another chance... She stopped herself. I wouldn't waste it. I turned toward her. The woman standing before me wasn't the same person who had left me 5 years earlier. Life had humbled her. Loss had changed her. But forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. I forgive you, Emily. A tear rolled down her cheek. But, she nodded before I even finished. I know. You don't know if you can love me again. I answered truthfully. I don't. She smiled through her tears. Thank you for being honest. Then she did something I never expected. She took a step back. I won't ask again. If someday your answer changes, you know where to find me. And if it never changes, I'll still be grateful you forgave me. She turned and walked back inside. I watched her go, realizing something profound. Years earlier, she had walked away chasing wealth. Tonight, she walked away respecting my choice. That alone proved how much she had changed. 3 months passed. Winter arrived once again. One snowy afternoon, Marcus walked into my office carrying 2 coffee cups. Zoe, are you going to spend the rest of your life pretending you don't smile every time Emily's name comes up? I laughed. Am I that obvious? You've forgiven her. Yes. You trust her. I think so. You still love her. I stared out the window at the falling snow. For the first time, I didn't deny it. But before I could decide what to do, life made the decision for me. Because the next morning, I received a phone call from the foundation. Emily had collapsed while helping a family. She was being rushed to the hospital. And as I raced through the snowy streets toward the emergency room, I realized just how terrified I was of losing her again. The drive to the hospital felt longer than any journey I'd ever taken. Every red light seemed to last forever. Every passing second tightened the knot in my chest. I kept telling myself to stay calm. Emily was probably exhausted. She worked too much. She skipped meals whenever a grieving family needed her. There had to be a simple explanation. There had to be. When I reached the emergency room, Rachel was already there. She stood up the moment she saw me. She's awake, she said softly. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. What happened? The doctors think it was exhaustion and severe dehydration. I closed my eyes. For the first time that morning, I felt my heartbeat slow. A few minutes later, a nurse led me into Emily's room. She looked embarrassed more than anything else. I guess I caused a little drama. I couldn't help smiling. You scared everyone. I'm sorry. You've apologized enough for one lifetime. For the first time in years. She laughed. A real laugh. Not forced. Not polite. The same laugh I had fallen in love with years earlier. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Not about the past. Not about Richard. Not about regret. We talked about the future. About the families the foundation had helped. About the little girl who wrote me the thank you card. About Rachel's children. About ordinary things. It felt strangely peaceful. When I finally stood to leave, Emily looked at me. Ethan? Yeah? I've spent years believing I didn't deserve happiness. I walked back to her bedside. You don't have to earn happiness. You just have to choose what kind of person you'll be when it finds you. Tears filled her eyes again. But this time, they weren't tears of guilt. They were tears of hope. Over the following weeks, Emily recovered completely. The doctors insisted she slow down. For once, she listened. One Saturday afternoon, I invited her to the lake house. Nothing fancy, just homemade pizza. When she stepped into the kitchen, she smiled. Friday night pizza? I grinned. Some traditions are worth keeping. We laughed until midnight, just like we used to. Only this time, neither of us took the moment for granted. Spring arrived, painting Chicago with fresh green leaves and warm sunshine. The Carter Hope Foundation had now helped thousands of families across the country. New centers were opening in several states. People often asked why we worked so hard. The answer was simple. Pain loses its power when it becomes purpose. One evening, I drove Emily to a quiet hill overlooking Lake Michigan. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. Emily looked at it, confused. Ethan? I opened the box. Inside wasn't a diamond necklace or an expensive watch. It was something far simpler. Our original wedding rings. I'd kept mine all those years. Richard had quietly returned hers before he passed away. Emily covered her mouth with both hands. I thought they were gone. So did I. I took a deep breath. I can't erase what happened. I can't pretend those 5 years never existed. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know. But I also can't ignore the woman you've become. The woman who spends every day helping strangers. The woman who stayed beside a dying man because compassion mattered more than resentment. The woman who finally understands that love isn't measured by bank accounts. I held out the ring. I'm not asking us to go backward. I'm asking if you'd like to build something new. Emily couldn't speak. She simply nodded again and again. Finally, she whispered, Yes. With all my heart, yes. I slipped the ring onto her finger. Neither of us noticed the tears. We were both crying. A year later, we stood in the memorial garden of the Carter Hope Foundation. Not for another wedding, not for a grand celebration, just a quiet gathering with family, close friends, Marcus, Rachel, and the people who had walked beside us through our darkest days. There were no reporters, no luxury ballroom, no expensive decorations. Only love. Rachel smiled as she hugged us both. You finally figured it out. I laughed. It only took us a decade. Before everyone left, I walked alone to the small stone memorial dedicated to the child. Emily and I never had the chance to meet. Fresh flowers rested beneath it. I quietly placed my hand on the stone. You changed us, I whispered. You never took a single breath. But because of you, thousands of families found hope. The evening breeze drifted across the garden. For the first time in many years, I felt completely at peace. People sometimes ask me if I regret giving Emily a second chance. My answer surprises them. No. Because forgiveness isn't about pretending someone never hurt you. It's about refusing to let that hurt control the rest of your life. Some people will betray you. Some dreams will fall apart. Some chapters will break your heart. But if you keep choosing kindness, keep choosing purpose, keep believing tomorrow can be better than yesterday, life has a remarkable way of writing endings you could never have imagined. And every Friday night, in a quiet house overlooking Lake Michigan, two people who once lost everything still make homemade pizza together. Not because it's special, but because they finally learned the richest life isn't the one filled with money. It's the one filled with people who choose to stay.